Section 4. Americans from Africa. Chapter 8. The Blacks. Black Americans were the only racial or ethnic group brought to America against their will. They came from a vast continent, larger than Europe, and initially spoke a great variety of languages and represented many very different cultures. In more than 2 centuries of bondage, their many ancestral languages and cultures faded away, and their genetic differences were amalgamated, together with a substantial mixture of Caucasian genes, to produce the American Negro, a cultural and biological product of the New World, rather than a direct descendant of any given African nation or culture. Black Americans are thus among the oldest Americans, and their cultural heritage is one formed almost exclusively on American soil. In another sense, blacks are among the newer Americans, entering the larger society as a free people with an independent existence of their own only in 1863 with the abolition of slavery. Their arrival in urban America, after massive internal migrations, came even later, so that many, perhaps most, blacks today are only the second generation in the urban world in which they live. In that sense, blacks are about where the Irish were 100 years earlier. In short, marking the starting point from which to measure the progress of black people in the United States is not easy and may vary with the particular issue. While Africans were amalgamated in America, Afro-Americans were also differentiated, not according to ancestral cultures as among other groups, but according to different histories in the United States. The time of acquiring freedom was a crucial differentiation. Although most American Negroes were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, 500,000 were already free before then. These free persons of color had a history, a culture, and a set of values that continued to distinguish their descendants from other Negroes well into the 20th century. A third, small but important segment of the black population consists of immigrants from the West Indies. They too have had a very different economic and social history from that of other blacks. Africa. Although little or no African culture survives among American Negroes, the history of Africa is not without relevance to how and why masses of Africans came to be captured and sent to the Western Hemisphere as slaves. While the continent of Africa is larger than Europe, its coastline is not as long as that of Europe, because Africa has few natural harbors indenting its coast. Africa's rivers are only intermittently navigable, according to terrain and season of the year. Dense jungles and vast deserts add to the difficulty of internal transportation and communication. Narrow coastal plains bounded by cliffs and mountains limited the size of coastal settlements. The net result has been a continent of highly fragmented and isolated peoples, speaking more than 800 languages and divided into myriad tribes. The political and military vulnerability of people in such conditions provided the opportunity for their mass enslavement by foreigners. The great civilizations on the African continent arose where these geographic barriers were not so formidable. The 400-mile-long Nile River, mostly navigable, provided the economic and social basis for the ancient civilization of Egypt. Mediterranean ports and land routes to Asia also enabled the northern part of Africa to develop larger and more complex nations than Africa south of the Sahara. The more united and powerful peoples of that region, the Arabs, became the first mass enslavers of African Negroes. Slavery had long existed among the African tribes, as it had existed for centuries among Europeans, going back to ancient Greece and Rome. But massive commercial sales of Negro slaves began after the conquest of northern Africa by the Arabs in the 8th century. Arab slave traders penetrated down into the center of Africa and on the east coast as far south as Mozambique. In cooperation with local tribes, they captured or purchased slaves to take back with them across the Sahara Desert, which eventually became strewn with the skeletons of Negroes who died on the long march across the burning sands. The Arabs were notable as the most cruel of all slave masters. As late as the 19th century, British explorer David Livingstone had nightmares for weeks after witnessing the treatment of slaves by Arabs. Slavery was not completely abolished in the Arab world until after the middle of the 20th century. Slavery in Europe had died out over the centuries when Africans were brought to Spain by Arab slave traders. The Spanish and Portuguese eventually ventured to sub-Sahara Africa to capture their own slaves. By the time Columbus discovered America, Spain and Portugal already contained small but significant numbers of Negro slaves. When the Spanish began to colonize the Western Hemisphere, they transported masses of slaves there from Africa to do the hard work. As the British, French, and Portuguese followed suit in exploring and colonizing, they also began to buy or seize masses of Africans to ship to the New World. By the middle of the 17th century, 10,000 slaves per year were being transported across the Atlantic. By the 18th century, the slave trade had reached a peak of 60,000 per year. Over the centuries, nearly 10 million African slaves were shipped to the Western Hemisphere. More than half came in the century ending in 1820. More than 80% came between the beginning of the 18th and the middle of the 19th centuries. Many of the slaves came from a region of West Africa east of the river Niger, as many as from all the rest of Africa put together. The Ashanti tribe alone sold thousands of other Africans into slavery. In addition to the millions actually transported across the Atlantic, many uncounted others died along the way, some fighting to defend their freedom in Africa, some killed trying to escape, some by suicide in captivity, and many by death at sea during the hazard and horrors of the voyage to America. The loss of life at sea alone ranged from about 9 to 16% of all African slaves shipped by the British, French, and Spanish in the 18th and 19th centuries, and ranged even higher in the 17th century and among Dutch slave ships. A rough conservative estimate would be that 1 million slaves died en route. This does not count the Africans killed by European diseases for which they lacked biological immunity. Just as many Europeans died from African diseases to which they were vulnerable. Out of a grand total of about 10 million African slaves who arrived in the Western Hemisphere, about 400,000 were shipped to the American colonies. Slavery in America. The United States held the largest number of slaves of any country in the Western Hemisphere, more than 1/3 of all slaves in the hemisphere in 1825. Yet other countries actually imported more slaves, and Brazil 6 times as many. The difference was that the United States was the only country in which the slave population reproduced itself and grew by natural increase. In the rest of the hemisphere, the death rate was so high and the birth rate so low that continuous replacements were imported from Africa. The conditions under which slaves were held were generally more brutal in other countries. However, they were brutal in the United States as well. Whippings were common. The sale of children away from their parents happened often enough to be a danger to be constantly feared. The forcible separation of husbands and wives also occurred with considerable frequency, about 1 out of 6 couples. Other cruelties and atrocities, though sporadic, were inherent features in the institution of slavery and the caprice of slave owners. In narrowly material terms, slaves in the United States were usually amply fed with low-quality food, and their housing, although primitive by today's standards, was comparable to, or better than, that of contemporary European peasants or workers. The average lifespan of 19th century American slaves was slightly below that of whites in the United States, but the same as the lifespan in Holland and France, and greater than that in Italy or Austria. Slaves in the United States lived an average of 36 years. Peasants in Ireland, 19 years. To the slave owner, slaves were an investment and one to be safeguarded. For example, slave owners usually hired white workers, typically Irish immigrants, to do work considered too dangerous for slaves. The central feature of any slave system, preventing escape, was accomplished in the antebellum South not by fences or guards, but by keeping the slave ignorant, dependent, and in fear. The overwhelming majority of slaves could neither read nor write, and most southern states made it a crime to teach them. Because slaves were kept in captivity by ignorance rather than by physical restraints, it was easy to escape a slave plantation temporarily, but very difficult to escape permanently. Patrols manned by local whites recaptured runaways and regulated or punished other slaves who were off their plantations for whatever reason. The slaves were kept dependent on the slave owners for rations of food or clothing, and for the organization of their daily lives and living conditions. A leading slave owner advised, "Create in him a habit of perfect dependence on you." This philosophy, in practice, was observed during the celebrated travels of Frederick Law Olmsted through the South. Olmsted concluded that the Southern strategy was to try to train the slave to work, and yet prevent him from learning to take care of himself. With many generations of discouragement of initiative, and with little incentive to work any more than necessary to escape punishment, slaves developed foot-dragging, work-evading patterns that were to remain as a cultural legacy long after slavery itself disappeared. Duplicity and theft were also pervasive patterns among antebellum slaves, and these too remained long after slavery ended. Among themselves, slaves had to evolve some pattern for living. Racial solidarity was basic, and betrayal to whites unforgivable. Even the slave driver, a slave immediately in charge of other slaves and authorized to mete out punishment, had to make his compromises within that framework. On large plantations, some house servants might form personal attachments to members of the white household, but they too had to respect the line between internal differences among blacks and outright betrayal to whites. The black world was ultimately the only world in which slaves could find emotional fulfillment and close attachments, and to become a pariah there meant personal devastation. The norms of the slave community, therefore, carried weight, even without official sanction or institutions to enforce them. Incest taboos, for example, were more widely observed among slaves than among contemporary whites. Marriages between first cousins were common among white slave owners, but very rare among black slaves, in keeping with differences in incest taboos between Europe and Africa. In short, the slave community had its own norms, which were not mere copies of the whites' patterns. Even slave owners found it expedient to accommodate the wider incest taboos of blacks by allowing marriages between their slaves and slaves who lived on other farms and plantations, even when there were eligible mates, by white standards, in the slave plantation community. In one rare case of nuclear family incest, the slave owner was forced to sell a father who had made his daughter pregnant, for other slaves had threatened to kill him. There were manners and mores among slaves. The young addressed their elders as uncle and aunt. Whites forbade blacks to use titles such as Mr. or Mrs. to one another, and took their hats off when approaching them. When a slave couple was caught off the plantation without permission by a patrol, the man was expected to volunteer to take the woman's whipping as well as his own. The slave community evolved its own culture as well as its own mores. Its most notable cultural product was the Negro spiritual, which later had such offshoots as the blues and jazz, setting the framework for the whole development of American popular music. Some of the folk music of the Negro was also incorporated into Dvorak's New World Symphony. The banjo was invented by a free Negro during the era of slavery. The fables and folklore of the slaves also provided a basis for such adaptations as the Brer Rabbit stories by a white Southerner, Joel Chandler Harris. Unlike the moral fables of an ancient slave, Aesop, the stories of the Negro slaves in America generally featured the weak and humble triumphing over the powerful, arrogant, and blind. The most important human relationships among the slaves centered on the family. Slave marriages and slave family relations had no legal standing, but usually lasted for decades, if not for a lifetime. This pattern existed throughout slave society, in all geographic regions, in both rural and urban settings, among field hands as well as house servants. A local study of ex-slave couples in 1866 showed that more than half of those in their 40s had been together for 20 or more years. While premarital sex and premarital pregnancy existed among slaves, marriage itself was taken very seriously and was not lightly terminated. Sometimes slave marriages were forcibly terminated, usually by the sale of one of the partners. Most of these forcibly terminated marriages had also lasted many years. The testimony of many former slaves told of the anguish these partings caused, and many slave owners were reluctant to part slave couples for fear that the remaining partner would try to escape. Still, nearly 1/6 of Mississippi blacks in 1864 to 65 had been forcibly separated from a spouse. After emancipation, many separated couples searched for each other for years. During slavery, there were instances of suicide after separation, and of murder of whites for raping a slave wife, although that meant sure death for the man who killed the rapist. That there were hundreds of documented instances of slaves murdering whites, for a variety of reasons, also suggests that the enslaved people were not lacking in values that were deeply felt. In addition to the documented instances of murder, there were many poisonings and arson not traceable to anyone, although it was known that these were among the favorite weapons of slaves. Most of the children of slaves grew up in two-parent families, with the father as head and, secretly, bore his surname. Because of premarital relationships, some families contained children fathered by someone else, but a local study of 19th century slave families indicated that, in 3/4 of the families, all the children had the same father and mother. In short, slave families were stable, insofar as slaves could keep them so. The offspring could, at any time, be sold away from the family and never seen again. Most sales of slaves were of teenagers and young single adults, so that the relative stability of slave marriages did not mean a stability of the slave family. Slave owners found marriage and family relations among slaves a stabilizing force, reducing the incidence of fighting over women and inhibiting escape attempts. However, the strength of family ties among slaves was also seen as inappropriate to their status, a threat to master-slave relationships, and a source of difficulty when individual slaves were sold. Slave owners tried to keep family ties from becoming so strong as to interfere with slavery itself. They forbade the slaves to use family names, and slaves were liable to punishment even for using such expressions as "my sister" or "my mother." This only drove such expressions underground. Surnames were passed down for generations in black families, though all knew better than to use them around whites, and even after emancipation, many ex-slaves remained reluctant to tell whites their surnames because of the habit of concealing them had become so ingrained. The surnames of slaves were usually not the surnames of their owners. More often, it was a name whose origins were lost in generations past, sometimes the name of an owner of a previous generation of the family, or simply a name chosen by African ancestors when they arrived in America. Its purpose was not to connect the black family with the white person from whom the name was taken, but to give the black family an enduring mark of identification for itself. The same was true of the given name of slaves. About 1/4 of the boys were named for their fathers, and many children were named for uncles or aunts, or for siblings who had died or had been taken away and sold. Significantly, daughters were usually not named for mothers, although that was a common pattern among contemporary whites. Here again, the slave community had its own customs. Slavery as an institution was not the same everywhere or at all times. It varied considerably over time, from one place to another, and from one kind of occupation to another. 3/4 of all white families in the South owned no slaves at all. Of those who did, most were on farms rather than on plantations, and few plantations ever reached the size or magnificence of the fictional antebellum Southern estates, such as those depicted in Gone with the Wind. Regional differences. As a result of the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the growing of cotton ultimately became the work of 60% of all slaves in the United States. Slaves were increasingly concentrated in those parts of the South where soil and climate were most suitable for the growing of cotton. The states of the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and Louisiana, had rapidly increasing numbers of slaves, while Upper South states like Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas had declining numbers of slaves. The geographic center of the black population moved steadily southwestward, at an average of about 50 miles per decade. Between 1830 and 1860, well over 500,000 slaves were moved from the Upper South to the Deep South. Most of this massive movement of slaves, aptly called one of the great forced migrations in world history, occurred by the relocation of slave owners with their workforces, rather than by the sale of individual slaves. But the latter also occurred often enough to spread fear among the slaves, fear of being sold away from family and friends, and to leave as an historical residue in the language the phrase "sold down the river." Yet even when a whole plantation moved together, this often severed family ties because some family members, particularly husbands and fathers, were often owned by someone else and lived on a different farm or plantation. Some parts of the country were more suitable than others for growing the kinds of crops that were economically feasible to produce with slave labor. Crops requiring routine mass production labor that could be easily monitored by overseers were particularly suitable to slave labor. Cotton growing was the classic example in the United States, but sugar production in Louisiana and in much of Latin America also fit that pattern. Other staple crops such as rice, wheat, and corn were also grown with mass production slave labor. Climate and soil largely determined where such crops could be grown and therefore determined the geographic distribution of slaves. Relatively few slaves were ever used in the North, where the climate was unsuitable for plantation crops, and parts of the South likewise had little plantation slavery. One such southern area was the Piedmont or foothill region running through western Virginia, western North Carolina, eastern Kentucky, and eastern Tennessee. It is an erosion-prone region with lean soil, unsuitable for plantation slave crops. Neither the slave plantation nor the racial ideology that justified it took as deep roots here as in the fertile Mississippi Delta and the rich land of the Black Belt stretching across Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. These Deep South states have historically been the most extreme and intransigent on racial issues, first slavery and later civil rights, while the liberal elements in the South came largely from the Piedmont region. Anti-slavery newspapers were concentrated in Kentucky and western Virginia, which later broke away to form a separate state rather than join the Confederacy along with the rest of Virginia. John Brown operated in this region. So did the Underground Railroad, which helped slaves escape to free states. The first periodical in the United States devoted exclusively to the abolition of slavery was published in eastern Tennessee. In North Carolina, a manumission society existed in the 1820s, which would have been unheard of in the Deep South. Free Negroes in North Carolina were permitted to vote until 1835, and their disenfranchisement that year was opposed by almost all the western counties of the Piedmont region, where the Germans and the Scotch-Irish lived. Racism and pro-slavery sentiment existed in all these states, but the mixture and intensity of feeling varied substantially. The moderate Whig political party was able to contend with the pro-slavery Democrats only in those parts of the South that were in the Piedmont region. The raw facts of geography not only reduced the incidence of plantation slavery in the Piedmont, The absence of a slave economy and society attracted to such areas people who did not want to compete with the labor of slaves or to be part of such a society. These included people of Scotch-Irish and German ancestry, who poured down from western Pennsylvania through the Cumberland Gap and into the Piedmont region. This region also attracted many Quakers, whose religion forbade the holding of slaves and who were prominent in anti-slavery activity, especially in North Carolina. In short, the effect of geographic differences within the South were accentuated by differences in the people attracted to these different regions. Changes over time. The first Africans brought in captivity to colonial Virginia in 1619 became indentured servants, like the white indentured servants who were common at that time. Both were released as free people after some years of bondage. Precisely when and how this situation changed to perpetual slavery for blacks remain unclear, but by the 1640s, Africans brought into Virginia no longer had indenture contracts, although as late as 1651, some Negroes whose period of indenture expired were still being assigned land for themselves, like the white indentured servants at the end of their term of service. The first explicit law passed in America that recognized slavery as a perpetual condition, extending to future offspring, appeared in 1661 in Virginia. By the time Africans began to be brought to other colonies, the precedent of Virginia law was followed, and slavery was their fate from the outset. Slavery has existed for thousands of years in virtually every part of the world, but slavery as it evolved in America had unique features. Whereas slavery was politically and morally accepted without question for centuries in many nations, even by the leading moralists of the times, the bringing of African captives to America was embroiled in controversy from the beginning. Some colonies passed laws to prevent it, but these laws were nullified by the British government. Opposition to slavery did not necessarily imply either moral scruples or human concern for Negroes. There are economic, social, and military problems created by the presence of a large number of racially distinct people held in bondage, and many Americans wanted to spare themselves such problems. This, in fact, continued to be a major element in later anti-slavery efforts, which often included schemes to send Negroes back to Africa. Once the decision had been made, in London, to institute slavery in America, the options facing all subsequent generations of Americans were radically changed. The issue of the wisdom or justice of slavery now had to compete with the issue of whether the new American nation could absorb an alien people with no experience of free, self-supporting existence in this society, a people constituting about 20% of the total population in 1800. Slavery in a free society raised heated issues that kept political controversy alive throughout the history of the institution in the United States. It forced ideological justification that other slave societies had not found necessary. Essential to these justifications was the assertion that the enslaved peoples were so different that the principles and ideals of the country did not apply to them, that they were inferior in intellect and lacked the feelings that would cause them suffering from degradation, hard work, or the destruction of family ties. The intense racism that developed as a defense of slavery in the American setting meant that merely freeing individuals or even abolishing the institution of slavery itself would not be the end of the problem. Indeed, the intensity of racism made even anti-slavery advocates, including de Tocqueville and Lincoln, fearful of the effects of emancipation. Such problems are not inherent in slavery as an institution. No such enduring stigma attached to ex-slaves and their descendants in the Roman Empire, where one of the emperors, Diocletian, was the son of ex-slaves. What was peculiar about American slavery was that 1. The slaves and masters were physically different. 2. Slavery in a free society required extreme ideological justification. And 3. The moral quandary of slavery as an institution here finally emerged and became heated in both England and America, leading eventually to an agreement between the two nations to ban the international slave trade in 1808. The American Revolution and its ideals made the moral issues of slavery more prominent and central. During and after the Revolutionary War, northern states began banning slavery, and southern states began passing laws to ameliorate the treatment of slaves. In Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Patrick Henry, and James Madison all publicly advocated the abolition of slavery, as did many other people throughout the South. Any hope of success was destroyed when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, making the South the Cotton Kingdom, not only of the United States but of the world. The dilemma of slavery and emancipation was now localized. Northern states had avoided the problems of emancipation by announcing a future ban on slavery, causing northern slaves to be sold to the South. The question of what to do with millions of people who had been denied a normal development was no longer a national question, but a regional one. Slave uprisings and massacres of whites in the Caribbean spread fear throughout the South toward the end of the 18th century. Rumors of plots for similar slave uprisings in the United States periodically revived these fears. In 1831, such an uprising materialized in Virginia, led by Nat Turner, and killed 60 whites before it was crushed. On the political front, the rise of militant abolitionist movements in the North in the 1830s added to the South's sense of being beleaguered. All of these events heightened Southern regionalism. This was expressed externally in bitter political attacks on its enemies and in widespread violence in new territories such as Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas, where Southerners and Northern settlers bitterly fought for control to determine whether the state would enter the Union as a state permitting or forbidding slavery. Internally, the South tightened its black codes, laws regulating the conduct of both slaves and free blacks. It stamped censorship on abolitionist literature, even censoring the U.S. mails, and made life intolerable for those who opposed or even questioned the institution of slavery. These repressions, in turn, led many with different views to migrate out of the South. Their departure left behind a more conformist and intolerant Southern population. The legacy of slavery. Numerous genetic, linguistic, and cultural distinctions among Africans were obliterated in more than 2 centuries of slavery, but the black population became differentiated in a new pattern based on occupational roles under slavery, on the date of family emergence into freedom, and on proportion of white ancestry. There were significant differences in the work performed by slaves. Domestic servants, or house slaves, had more opportunities to acquire American culture, including literacy in a few cases, and values than did field hands. Urban slaves, most of whom were domestic servants, had still wider exposure, extending well beyond the slave-owning family. About 30% of urban slaves worked as employees, paid part of their earnings to their respective slave owners, but often lived separately in housing they rented for themselves, and otherwise lived daily lives not very different from those of ordinary free working people. Even on the farms and plantations, where the great majority of slaves lived, there were privileges and pride developed among drivers, slaves in skilled occupations, and other isolated individuals. Finally, there were the free persons of color, nearly 500,000 in 1860, who had somehow escaped the fate of the 5 million blacks who were enslaved. The first free persons of color were the captured Africans who were brought to Virginia in 1619, and who became free at the end of the traditional indenture period. But even after perpetual slavery became an established institution in the American colonies, individual slaves continued to acquire freedom by one means or another. In 1790, there were about 60,000 free persons of color. Many northern states abolished slavery, and many individuals, and the whole Quaker community, manumitted their slaves in the ideological aftermath of the American Revolution. The number of free persons of color grew to more than 300,000 by 1830. Another reason for blacks achieving freedom may be suggested by the facts that 1. 37% of the free persons of color were mulattoes, compared to only 8% of the slaves, and that 2. There were always more women than men among free Negroes, a pattern common throughout the Western Hemisphere. Some of those freed were simply the children of slave owners and their mothers. This was often openly acknowledged in Latin America, but not in Anglo-Saxon countries. The lives of most free persons of color were narrowly circumscribed economically, politically, and legally. They were usually poor, unskilled workers, lacked basic civil rights in most of the South and much of the North, and had little or no legal protection against fraud or even violence by whites. Nevertheless, they were years, or even generations, ahead of the slaves in their acculturation to American society. Most free persons of color could read and write in 1850, although only 1 or 2% of the slaves could do so. It would be 1900 before the literacy rate of the black population as a whole rose to a level reached by the free persons of color in the middle of the 19th century. It would be 1940 before the black population as a whole became urbanized as the free persons of color were in 1850. In short, free persons of color had a large head start over the rest of the black population in their adjustment to American society. There were enduring consequences to this head start. The descendants of free persons of color remained prominent among Negro leadership in many fields on into the 20th century. They were among the founders, supporters, and early leaders of the NAACP. W.E.B. Du Bois, Thomas Fortune, and Charles Waddell Chestnut were all descendants of the free persons of color, as was Thurgood Marshall in a later era. So, apparently, were most black holders of doctoral degrees in the middle of the 20th century and most Negroes working in the professions in the nation's capital. Free persons of color and their descendants were responsible for the founding and running of the first and most outstanding black public high school, Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., which turned out the first black general, the first black federal judge, the first black cabinet member, the discoverer of blood plasma, the first popularly elected black senator, the first black professor at a major university, and a long list of other firsts in many fields. Because white ancestry was more common among free persons of color than among slaves, lighter complexioned Negroes were long overrepresented among high-achieving members of the race, leading both whites and blacks to attribute their success to a genetic superiority based on their white ancestry. Color consciousness mixed with class consciousness in the black elite, which long remained remote and aloof from the black population, although speaking publicly in their name. As with other groups, initial historic advantages among blacks produced enduring internal differences. From Emancipation to Jim Crow. The Civil War was not only the turning point in the history of black Americans, it was itself a final trauma in the story of slavery. As this bloody and desperate war dragged on for 4 years, the Southern economy was drained and disrupted, and blacks and whites alike suffered as both armies confiscated food and committed other depredations and sometimes atrocities. Blacks were also more directly part of the war. More than 186,000 black soldiers were in the Union Army, constituting about 10% of all federal troops. 21 blacks won the Congressional Medal of Honor during the Civil War. Desertion, a major problem during the war, was more common among white soldiers than among black soldiers. Ambivalence marked the relations between blacks and whites in the South during the Civil War. Even across the barriers of slavery, emotional ties had formed, as well as bitter resentments and domineering cruelties. Some slaves remained loyal and even protective toward the slave-owning family, while the man was away fighting for the Confederacy. Other slaves escaped to freedom as the Northern armies approached. Often, the same individual behaved ambivalently, like the slave who carried his wounded master back from the battlefield to a safe hiding place, and then himself escaped in the opposite direction to join the Union Army. Whites were equally ambivalent, praising and damning blacks, laughing at them and crying with them, giving the slave paternalistic solicitude and individual generosity, and yet whipping them and selling them like cattle. The emotional shock of slave owners was apparent in numerous post-war expressions of disappointment or despair at what the whites considered the desertion or ingratitude of many slaves who refused to stay on, even as paid employees of their former masters. The emotional resentment of whites toward blacks was not confined to former slave owners. Beaten, weary, and hungry Confederate soldiers, returning home to a disrupted and sometimes destroyed and starving South, vented their bitterness in atrocities against helpless blacks. Slave owners sometimes took revenge against the women and children of black men who escaped from slavery to join the Union Army. After 2 centuries of slavery, in which Negroes were conceived to have no rights, white Southerners resented not only emancipation, but also any behavior, words, or attitudes by blacks implying common humanity or common rights. The general attitude of white Southerners towards blacks was aptly summed up by a colonel in the Union Army in the South in 1865. To kill a Negro they do not deem murder. To debauch a Negro woman they do not think fornication. To take property away from a Negro they do not consider robbery. It was an attitude summarized earlier by the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, which declared that blacks had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. In short, the freedom of American Negroes began in an atmosphere that was as unpromising emotionally as it was economically and politically. Although blacks suffered in body and mind under slavery, they did not emerge as a spiritually crushed people. Great numbers of black men fought ably during the Civil War. During the Northern occupation of the South, black soldiers controlled and disciplined whites. The position of newly freed blacks was made precarious by the undependable protection of the Union Army and the rampant terrorism of white mobs and vigilantes. Racial violence and terrorism used against blacks to try to keep them in their place were evidence that they were not wholly submissive. Freedom was, for blacks, both a deliverance and an uprooting. Many took to the roads, carrying their meager belongings in bundles, often hungry, sick, and barely clad, either looking for a new life somewhere or trying to locate family members long separated by sales on the slave market. As a contemporary Freedmen's Bureau official observed, every mother's son among them seemed to be in search of his mother, every mother in search of her children. A contemporary journalist reported meeting black men walking along the roads of Virginia and North Carolina, many of whom had walked across the state or across more than one state, looking for their families. Many parents made what a contemporary federal official characterized as superhuman efforts to find their children. After several months, the mass migrations subsided, but the search for lost family members continued through newspaper advertisements that filled the newly established black newspapers on into the 1880s. Occupations. One of the great fears of white Southerners, and then of the federal military occupation officials, was that the newly freed slaves would not settle down and work, but would continue to live off emergency government rations, given to both blacks and whites in the war-torn South, and private charity, supplemented by thefts. Local government, often with the support of federal authority, imposed stringent vagrancy laws applied to black adults, compulsory apprentice laws for black children, and numerous other statutes and regulations severely restricting the freedom of choice of the newly freed slaves as to where and for whom to work. The abuses under these laws sometimes amounted to a virtual re-enslavement of blacks. Most blacks continued to do the same kind of work after emancipation as under slavery. As late as 1890, more than half of all Negroes worked in agriculture, and more than 30% worked as domestic servants. In the Deep South, the proportion in agriculture was even higher. Among those few Negroes living outside the South, domestic service employed more than 60%. Professionals were rare, only 1% of black workers. In one respect, however, work patterns did change. Many black women who were married now stayed home to raise their children instead of working in the fields or in white people's homes. The consternation and resentment this produced among Southern whites who lost a portion of their house servants were indicative of the whites' underestimates of the importance of family life to blacks. Most blacks who worked in agriculture were agricultural laborers, although there were also sizable proportions of tenant farmers who paid their rent either in money or in a share of the crop. Negroes, as they emerged from slavery, were largely destitute of cash, and certainly lacked such sums as would be necessary to support themselves through a whole crop-growing season until harvest time. They were therefore dependent on white employers, landowners, and storekeepers, sometimes all the same person, to advance them the provisions needed to live until the crop was harvested. For some postbellum Negroes, this meant being perpetually in debt and in a state of virtual peonage. This situation, which has been widespread among other very poor agricultural peoples, was accentuated among blacks by their lack of experience in budgeting or in managing their own daily lives under slavery, and by the habits of carelessness, little foresight, and dependence on whites engendered by that system. Slaves had long been careless and wasteful with food, firewood, clothing, and other necessities issued to them by slave owners, and had cherished such small luxuries as they may have acquired, often as cast-off items from slave owners' family members. The economic weighing of necessities against luxuries, which was common and taken for granted among other peoples of the world, was something that slaves in the United States had not experienced for centuries. The initial habits, values, and behavior patterns of American Negroes as they emerged from slavery slowly changed over the years and generations, as they acquired new experience and changed perspectives. But, as with other groups, they did not all instantly adapt to the new realities. Over the years, different elements adapted to varying extents. For generations, on into the 20th century, black leaders themselves repeatedly complained about the wastefulness, extravagance, or improvidence of their own people. In the immediate post-Civil War era, blacks were kept in poverty not only by their own difficulties in learning to manage their own lives, but also by their pervasive illiteracy, which enabled white employers and storekeepers to cheat them while keeping the books on months of advances of food, clothing, and other items purchased on credit. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the newly freed Negroes were so inexperienced and vulnerable that some whites even continued to hold them as slaves by keeping the Emancipation Proclamation secret from them. However outrageous the frauds and deceptions of an employer or storekeeper might be, such people afterward found themselves deserted by their black workers or consumers. As a black man observed in 1866, "They may cheat the poor Negro out of a year's work, but in spite of them he has acquired a year's experience." Even without being able to read, write, or count, blacks could tell when relatives or friends elsewhere were doing better. Whites quickly acquired good or bad reputations among blacks, and the whites in turn quickly became aware that their reputations were a capital asset that had to be maintained for the sake of continuing profit. With many stores located within a short distance of each other, and many landowners needing labor, even illiterate people exercised their options. The mobility of blacks was supplemented by the mobility of white landowners, who rode on horseback from place to place, recruiting black workers. The changing character of the American Negro in the decades after the Civil War was reflected in changing economic relations between blacks and whites. As workers, blacks had acquired little sense of personal responsibility under slavery. Lack of initiative, evasion of work, half-done work, unpredictable absenteeism, and abuse of tools and equipment were pervasive under slavery. And these patterns did not suddenly disappear with emancipation. The immediate post-Civil War work patterns attempted to cope with these work habits. Some white landowners of the immediate postbellum period even insisted on the right to continue corporal punishment of their black laborers or sharecroppers, but this quickly subsided under the pressure of economic competition among landowners for laborers and sharecroppers. and because of active physical resistance by blacks themselves. Gang labor under white overseers was tried, as under slavery, but blacks preferred other systems whenever available. By 1880, the gang system was dying out. The work of black tenant farmers was at first closely supervised by white landowners, and even kept under surveillance by white store owners who advanced credit. But as blacks acquired more experience in managing their own farms, they began to acquire discretion and independence. The share of the crops going to black tenants tended to increase over time. By 1880, share rent systems began giving way to fixed rent systems, which bound the farmer to pay a fixed amount in cash or crops, no longer sharing the management or the risks with whites. By 1910, about 1/4 of all black farmers were owners or buyers rather than renters. None of these things happened automatically. They reflected a growing, although modest, level of responsibility and skill among blacks in agriculture and a consequent rise in the demand for their labor. The auxiliary benefits rose along with the wages and the crop shares. Immediately after the Civil War, most blacks lived in the same log cabins with dirt floors that they had lived in as slaves. Window panes were almost unknown. Gradually, log cabins were replaced by frame houses, dirt floors by planks, and by the turn of the century, glass window panes began to appear. The houses at this juncture were still usually lacking in plumbing, small, crowded, and almost inevitably dirty. Urban blacks were housed on the average with 3 rooms per family in 1896, crowded in that era of large families, but less so than the Jews or Italians of New York at the same time. In the post-Civil War era, Southern white employers and landowners sought to band together to restrict the money and discretion they had to give to blacks. Yet despite the economic strength, political power, and organizational advantages of the whites, these restrictive agreements failed repeatedly in the face of competition for laborers and sharecroppers. Black income grew at a higher percentage rate than white income during the last third of the 19th century. Job discrimination against blacks usually took the form of refusal to hire Negroes for various desirable jobs, rather than wage differentials for doing the same work. In money wage terms alone, wages paid whites in southern states averaged 8% higher than wages paid to blacks doing the same work at the turn of the century. But black workers often received pay in kind as well. When both races were paid entirely in cash, there was, in general, no racial differential. Politics. The Reconstruction era in the South under federal military occupation saw the emergence of civil rights and political power for blacks despite bitter opposition by Southern whites, often in the form of extra-legal intimidation and terror by various vigilante groups, of which the Ku Klux Klan became the most notorious. With the withdrawal of federal troops and the return of local government in the South after the political compromise of 1877, the political participation and civil rights of blacks declined sharply. An uneven retrogression for blacks continued for decades in the South, culminating in the pervasive segregation laws and discriminatory practices around the turn of the century, summarized as Jim Crow. The U.S. Supreme Court's 1896 ruling that separate but equal facilities were constitutional set the stage for massive and rigid racial segregation in public facilities that were usually far from equal. Along with the political and legal repression of Southern Negroes rose the number of lynchings of blacks to a peak of 161 per year in 1892. Lynchings had long been a Southern practice, but only after 1886 were there more blacks than whites lynched. With the passage of time, lynching became primarily a matter of whites killing blacks. Education. Virtually all slaves were illiterate, and slaves constituted about 90% of the black population in 1860. Public schools were a relatively new idea, still fighting for a foothold outside the South, and even rarer within the South. Under slavery, the law forbade teaching a slave to read or write in most Southern states, and even in many northern communities, blacks were not admitted to the public schools. Moreover, some states in the Deep South made it illegal for free persons of color to send their children to schools, even to private schools at their own expense. Despite this formidable array of barriers, black education has a long history in America. In the late 18th century, various philanthropic individuals and groups in the North either established schools for black children or enrolled black children in schools attended by whites. Blacks also took the initiative in creating schools for their own children. As early as 1807, the 500 free persons of color in Washington, D.C., built that city's first school for black children, the first of many private schools that free black children attended for decades before finally being admitted to the city's public schools in 1862. Among the prosperous free persons of color in New Orleans, education was widespread and extended for some all the way to the university level, for those able to send their offspring to Europe for an education. Similarly, in Baltimore, there were schools for the children of free Negroes by 1830. New York, Philadelphia, and other cities also had schools for black youngsters. Various white religious groups, notably the Quakers and the Catholics, also educated free black children, often in defiance of the law. So did some of the Scotch-Irish of the Piedmont region. After the Nat Turner insurrection of 1831 and the rise of abolitionism, the Southern states imposed ever tighter restrictions on the actions of all blacks, slave or free. It was in that period, roughly from 1830 to 1860, that many Southern states outlawed the teaching of black children by anyone. These laws led to widespread clandestine schools for free black children. About 3/5 of all free persons of color were literate in the census of 1850. In the cities, the literacy rate was higher, even in states with laws against educating black children. The eagerness with which newly freed Negroes sought education in the postbellum South was both dramatic and pathetic. Contemporary observers were surprised at the number of black adults as well as children who enrolled whenever an opportunity was presented to acquire literacy. This desire for education was not, however, based on any experience with the work that it entailed, nor on any realistic basis for assessing its actual contributions to their well-being. The conviction that education was a good thing to have was no substitute for the disciplined work or the intellectual values that make it possible or effective. Educating a people lacking these prerequisites was to prove a sore trial to generations of teachers of both races. Still, in one way or another, American Negroes went from a state of being nearly 100% illiterate to almost 75% literate in the 50 years after emancipation, a remarkable achievement. After the Civil War, Northern whites, largely from the American Missionary Association, moved into the South to establish schools to educate the children of the recently freed slaves. In less than a decade, they established more than 1,000 schools and sent more than 2,000 teachers into the South. In the half-century following the Civil War, Northern sources contributed an estimated $57 million to Negro education, and blacks themselves contributed an additional $24 million. In the early post-war years, the Freedmen's Bureau was the major contributor to black education, spending about $3.5 million in the period from 1865 to 1870. By contrast, public schooling for blacks was slow to get underway in the South, especially so at the secondary and higher levels. The first black public high school in the United States was established in 1870 in Washington, D.C. The first public high school for blacks in Baltimore was established in 1892, in New Orleans in 1916, and in Atlanta in 1924. Rural schooling for blacks remained far behind. As late as 1911, there were so many rural areas with no schools at all for black children that philanthropist Julius Rosenwald established a fund to contribute to the building of black schools in the South. Over the next 20 years, more than 50,000 such public schools were built with contributions of more than $4 million from the Julius Rosenwald Fund. When Julius Rosenwald died in 1932, more than 1/4 of all black children in the United States were being taught in schools whose construction he subsidized. It was 1916 before there were as many black youngsters attending public high schools as there were attending private high schools. Even after Southern states began building public schools for Negroes from 1913 to 1932, about 1/3 of their construction costs were shared equally by the Julius Rosenwald Fund and by small voluntary contributions from blacks themselves. In general, the sums spent by Southern states for educating blacks were some small fraction of the sums spent educating white students. Nor was this necessarily improving with time. The difference between expenditures per capita on blacks and whites in the public schools was greater in 1910 than in 1900 in every Southern state. In the schools set up by the American Missionary Association after the Civil War, 3/4 of the teachers were women, and 3/4 of the women were unmarried. These were the New England school marms, described in such terms as prim and forbidding, but dedicated. These white teachers with black students faced certain hostility and ostracism from the Southern whites, and some were threatened, beaten, or murdered. Their black pupils not only lacked any educational preparation or values, but were often guilty of absenteeism, tardiness, unreliability, lying, and theft. In the early post-war years, the average teacher lasted 3 years. Yet from this foundation was built the education that generations of blacks looked back on with gratitude and reverence. Later black leaders, from W.E.B. Du Bois to Booker T. Washington, praised the selfless work of these missionary school teachers who helped create an educated class of black Americans. Du Bois called it the finest thing in American history, and Mary McLeod Bethune spoke of those beloved, consecrated teachers who took so much time and patience with me when patience and tolerance were so needed. In higher education, the first black man to receive a college degree was a graduate of Bowdoin College in 1828. The first black woman to receive a college degree graduated from Oberlin in 1862. The first black man to receive a degree from Harvard graduated in 1870, and the first Harvard PhD awarded to a black man went to W.E.B. Du Bois in 1896. Throughout the whole 19th century, less than 2,000 Negroes received college or university degrees. A number of black colleges and universities were founded shortly after the Civil War by the American Missionary Association and by black religious groups, as well as Howard University by the federal government. But most of the black colleges actually taught pre-college material for many years before the major portion of their work was actually at the college level. Initially, they were essentially white-run colleges for black students, due to the scarcity of blacks with sufficient education to teach on a college faculty. The antebellum free persons of color were the most educated and acculturated element among American Negroes in the post-Civil War era. They and their descendants provided much of the leadership of the race on into the 20th century, with the notable exception of Booker T. Washington. As with other groups with internal cultural differences, continuing ambivalence marked the relationship between black leaders and the people in whose name they spoke. Where the cultural differences were greatest between the affluent Creole free persons of color in New Orleans and the recently freed blacks, so was the ambivalence. As of 1860, nearly 85% of free colored males in New Orleans were artisans, professionals, or owners of businesses. About 1/3 of the antebellum free-colored families of New Orleans owned slaves, and 3,000 of these free Creoles had joined the Confederate Army. Much of their immediate post-war effort went into differentiating themselves from the newly freed Negroes. They resisted efforts to relegate us to the rank of the brutalized slaves and denounced those who confused the newly freed people with our intelligent population. Nevertheless, being relegated to legal and social inferiority to whites gave the Creoles an incentive to fight for full political equality. but focusing on those aspects of life that were most important to themselves, whether or not they were the most urgent for the black masses. For example, the Creoles opposed the founding of Southern University, which provided desperately needed education for blacks because it represented a principle of racial separateness that was repugnant to the mulatto elite. The clash between ideological and pragmatic goals was to become an enduring source of internal struggle among black leaders, classically between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Socially, the Creoles remained separate from other Negroes on into the 20th century. The great jazz pianist Jelly Roll Morton was disowned by his Creole grandmother for associating with ordinary Negroes. New Orleans was the extreme example of a tendency that was far more widespread. Its history as a Latin slave society before becoming part of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 explains many social patterns there, including slave-owning Negroes, that were uncommon or unheard of in Anglo-Saxon slave societies. What was more general, however, was the division of the American Negro population into the black masses and the lighter-complexioned elite, from whom the political, economic, and social leadership came. The folk culture of the black masses, spirituals, jazz, dialect, was rejected by the elite in favor of the more aristocratic elements of white American culture. Color differences within the Negro population became social barriers, erected by many of the same people who first led the NAACP's fight against color barriers erected by whites. This apparent inconsistency was, however, quite consistent when seen as an attempt by the Negro elite to join the larger American elite from which it was excluded solely because of race. But the moral and political claims that might enable them to do so had to rest on democratic rhetoric and on their role as spokesmen for the whole race. The first of the nationally recognized black leaders was Frederick Douglass. An escaped slave and free many years before the Civil War, he combined the experiences that were to divide Negro leadership in later years. He was a tireless writer, lecturer, and political leader in both the antebellum and post-war eras. Douglass was an imposing man of bitter eloquence who fought for both pragmatic goals and goals of principle, for abolition of slavery, full civil rights, and for self-help among blacks. The Reconstruction era in the South seemed to promise the equality and progress for which Douglass had fought so long, but the Compromise of 1877 and the rise of Jim Crow and lynchings brought the black race in America to one of its lowest ebbs by the time of Douglass's death in February 1895. In the year of Douglass's death, there suddenly emerged a new black leader, Booker T. Washington. Born a slave and freed as a child by the Emancipation Proclamation, Washington had painfully acquired an education and had then become a teacher. In 1881, he headed up the newly founded Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. In September 1895, he delivered a speech at the Atlanta Exposition that brought him national recognition and launched his career as a Negro leader. Washington urged Southern Negroes to work out their destiny in the South, cast down your buckets where you are, and appealed to more moderate white Southerners to cooperate in pragmatic mutual concerns, however separate the races might remain socially. He said, "In all things that are social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress." His speech was welcomed by blacks and whites alike. W.E.B. Du Bois, his later rival, was among those who sent congratulations to Washington on his Atlanta Exposition speech. In this desperate era of Jim Crow, white vigilante terrorism, and lynchings, what Booker T. Washington offered was not a new set of goals, but a new order of priority in the existing goals. The political struggles that still preoccupied much of the black elite nationally seemed to him futile for the disenfranchised and vulnerable black masses in the Deep South. Washington's top priority was to meet the real needs and conditions of our people with basic skills and discipline, not only job skills, but how to bathe, how to care for their teeth and clothing. Tuskegee Institute concentrated on the most basic pragmatic concerns: work habits, hygiene, character. Its aim, in the words of one of its teachers, was the promotion of progress among the many and not the special culture of the few. This was the thrust of Washington's general social and political philosophy as well. He declared that political activity alone could not save the Negroes, for back of the ballot he must have property, industry, skill, economy, intelligence, and character. From the outset, Washington expressed his desire that all privileges of the law be ours, that there be universal free suffrage, and that the law be applied with absolute honesty to both races alike. But his public utterances seldom dwelled on these things. Privately, he aided and financed federal court challenges to Jim Crow laws, and sought to favorably influence political decisions affecting blacks from behind the scenes. But the major thrust of Washington's public utterances and educational activity was toward economic advancement and character development among the black masses. Although consumed by this goal, he did not consider it the ultimate limit of black aspirations, but as a necessary historical stage that would prepare the way for successful lawyers, congressmen, and music teachers. While Booker T. Washington's approach was primarily adapted to the situation of the black masses, W.E.B. Du Bois emerged in the early 20th century as a spokesman for what he called the talented tenth. Du Bois, a descendant of free mulattoes, grew up among the educated whites in Massachusetts and received a Ph.D. from Harvard. Du Bois's educational emphasis was on liberal arts rather than on the vocationalism of Washington, and his political emphasis was on unrelenting public pressure for full civil rights as soon as possible. He was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. These were differences of emphasis rather than of principle. Both men recognized the need of the great mass of blacks, only the second generation out of slavery, to acquire the skills and discipline to succeed in a complex modern economy. Both also recognized the need for higher levels of education and for that small part of the race already prepared and able to acquire it. The need for higher levels of education for that small part of the race already prepared and able to acquire it. The bitterness that ultimately developed between the followers of these two men is much more difficult to explain by their small differences in emphasis than by their personality differences and by their social differences. The black elite regarded Booker T. Washington as a spokesman for the black lower classes, the descendants of slave field hands. The NAACP, which Du Bois founded, was, initially at least, the preserve of the elite, and some lower-class blacks referred to it as the National Association for the Advancement of Certain People. Despite a divided black leadership, much was accomplished by both camps. There was more than enough work for both to do. The Great Migrations. The migration of the rural southern Negro toward the cities and toward the north began long before the Civil War. The antebellum free persons of color were by 1860 more urbanized than the white population, and the general direction of their population shifts was toward the northeast, while slaves were moving toward the southwest. At least 90% of all American Negroes lived in the South until the turn of the 20th century, but the antebellum free persons of color were evenly divided between North and South, and within the South they tended to gravitate toward its more liberal regions, such as the Piedmont area. The movement of blacks towards the cities and toward the North continued in the post-Civil War period, although on a relatively modest scale. The black population of a number of southern cities increased somewhat between 1850 and 1900, but there was little migration of blacks out of the South in the immediate post-Civil War period. Then began the Great Migrations. Black migration to the Northeast and the Midwest in the 1890s was more than double what it had been in the 1880s. A similar level of migration out of the South continued into the first decade of the 20th century, then doubled in the second decade, and again almost doubled in the 1920s. This mass movement of people compared in size with the great international migrations in history. More than 750,000 blacks left the South in the decade of the 1920s. more people than migrated from Ireland to the United States during the famine decade of the 1840s. There were many reasons for the size and timing of this mass exodus from the South: worsening race relations in the South toward the end of the 19th century, improving race relations in the North during the same period, the economic distress in the South caused by the boll weevil, and increasing job opportunities caused by the World War I mobilization, combined with a reduction of competitors as immigration fell sharply because of the war. Like most great migrations, internal or international, this was primarily a movement of those in the prime of life. Almost half of all black males from 15 to 34 years of age in Georgia left Georgia during the 1920s. The much higher birth rate in the South kept the number of Southern blacks increasing through 1960, even though the proportion of all blacks living in the South was declining. The consequences of the mass exodus of blacks out of the rural South were as historic as the magnitude of this migration. The massive northern black ghettos began during the era of these great relocations of population. Harlem, the first and most famous of these ghettos, was still predominantly white as late as 1910. More important, the lives of those living in most northern urban Negro communities prior to the Great Migrations were quite different from what they became afterward. There were small numbers of freed Negroes living in a number of northern cities long before the Civil War and even before the Revolutionary War. While there were some notable and financially successful individuals among them, most were working-class people with no special skills or status. As emancipation in the North and escaped slaves from the South added to their numbers, there was growing awareness of them and hostility to them by the white population in general and the lawmakers in particular. Discriminatory laws and practices arose, barring black children from schools and black adults from equal access to public accommodations. However, with the passage of time and a growing acculturation of these small Negro communities, such restrictions tended to relax, and there was even some modest upward mobility in occupations toward the end of the 19th century. As of 1860, blacks in Boston were not quite as badly off occupationally as the Irish, and in New York, black waiters in the 1880s were paid more than Irish waiters. As late as 1895, black laborers working on the Croton Reservoir in New York were paid more than Italian workers. New York blacks generally held modest but respectable jobs as barbers, waiters, or skilled craftsmen. Few were unskilled manual laborers, and most were better off than the mass of recent white immigrants to the city. Their general improvement was noted by Jacob Riis in his study of New York and by W.E.B. Du Bois in his study of Philadelphia. Toward the end of the 19th century, residential segregation was no longer of the magnitude that it had been before or would become again. In New York City, Negroes were more numerous in some neighborhoods than in others, but no neighborhood was all black. In Detroit, as early as 1860, no neighborhood was even 50% black, and in Chicago, as late as 1910, more than 2/3 of the black population lived in neighborhoods where the majority of residents were white. Similarly, in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., there was not yet racial segregation in housing of the sort that would become common later on. Northern urban blacks also acquired greater access to public accommodations, to the voting booth, and to a wider social role. Blacks were among the leading caterers in Philadelphia. In Detroit, black physicians and dentists had clienteles that were predominantly white. Black politicians were elected to public office in Michigan by a predominantly white electorate. In Chicago, social as well as business relations between blacks and whites were accepted, and even intermarriage was not unknown. In short, the last quarter of the 19th century represented an unprecedented period of racial amity and integration in northern urban communities. The beginning of the 20th century saw the beginning of a sharp reversal of these trends. The masses of unacculturated, ill-educated, rural Southern Negroes who flooded into the northern cities were bitterly resented by blacks and whites alike. The Negro middle class and northern Negro press denounced them as crude, vulgar, unwashed, rowdy, and criminal, and as a menace to the standing of the whole race in the eyes of the larger white community. These southern migrants soon became, in fact, the bulk of the northern black communities. Whites reacted to them by raising racial barriers against Negroes as a group. Now attempts by blacks to live in the same neighborhoods as whites brought forth violence. The Ku Klux Klan began to appear for the first time in northern cities. In 1911, Baltimore passed the first residential segregation law, copied by a number of other cities. Rigid job barriers, residential barriers, and social barriers arose, many to last for decades or generations. There was a pause in the migrations to the north during the Great Depression of the 1930s, when massive unemployment became pervasive in the big northern cities. But beginning in 1940, a new and even larger migration from the South resumed. Well over 1 million blacks moved out of the South in the decade of the 1940s and again in the 1950s. More than 4 million blacks migrated from the South between 1940 and 1970, a number comparable to the great international migrations in all of history. This was not simply a geographic movement. It was a mass uprooting from a rural southern way of life and a transformation into a modern industrial and urban way of life. It was, in short, the kind of traumatic social change that took other ethnic groups generations to adjust to. The social pathology that other groups experienced, violence, alcoholism, crime, delinquency, all reappeared in the transplanted black populations of the cities. Not only whites withdrew from contact with them, the older and more stable, settled, and financially secure black middle-class families tended to separate themselves from the newer arrivals socially and to lead an expansion of the ghetto into the surrounding white community, braving social barriers, restrictive covenants, and outright violence. They eventually won a legal battle against restrictive covenants when those were declared illegal in 1948. This was hailed as a great victory for the Negro race as a whole, although it made little or no difference in the residential patterns of most blacks and was impelled by a desire of the black elite to escape the black masses. Social conditions. The black migrants to the northern cities in the early 20th century represented a second massive uprooting of people in just 2 generations. After 2 centuries of slavery, 5 million Negroes were abruptly thrown into the midst of a war-ravaged and disorganized Southern economy and society, amid embittered, defeated, and often hungry whites steeped in the racial ideology used for centuries to sustain slavery. The blacks began destitute, illiterate, and unfamiliar with even the basics of hygiene, social behavior, or responsibility. As late as 1890, 3/5 of all black wage earners could neither read nor write. This was symptomatic of more general disadvantages and deficiencies that extended to the preservation of health and life itself. In 1896, Du Bois pointed out that personal cleanliness was woefully deficient among blacks, and that this, combined with bad eating habits and carelessness about their health in general, contributed to their rising mortality rates. The historical pattern of black mortality rates supports Du Bois's contention. In the decades immediately after emancipation, when blacks first became responsible for their own health, death rates among Negroes rose from what they had been under slavery. But as later generations of blacks became more experienced and acculturated, their death rates declined absolutely, and the large gap between black and white death rates also narrowed. The racial differential continued most acute in deaths from infectious diseases, syphilis, tuberculosis, pneumonia, rather than from degenerative diseases such as heart or kidney disease or cancer, which were less likely to reflect hygienic practices or crowded living conditions. Poverty and less access to medical care were also obvious factors, but factors that applied to degenerative as well as to infectious diseases. After decades of worsening oppression and terrorism in the South, the next generation of blacks began to move north, where life was economically and socially better for Negroes. But the condition of northern Negroes at that time were no indication of what southern Negroes could expect in the north. The rural southern migrants were still generations behind the northern urban Negroes in acculturation. One index of this was that Southern black school children continued for decades to be automatically put back a full year when they entered schools in Harlem or other northern ghettos, even though such schools might be substandard compared to white schools in the same cities. High rates of disease, alcoholism, and homicide so ravaged the black communities that many contemporary observers around the turn of the century predicted the eventual extinction of the race. Most of the migrants were young, more males than females, unmarried, and unskilled. With the passage of time, there was some modest upward movement, but as late as 1925, 72% of the black males in New York were either unskilled laborers or service workers, compared to 86% in 1905. The great bulk of black women were domestic servants. The percentage declined from 80 to 72% in New York City from 1910 to 1920, and by similar amounts in Chicago and Cleveland. About half of all black males were also domestic servants in 1910, but this declined below 40% by 1920 as more black men moved into factories and other urban manual labor. Few blacks worked in professional occupations, only about 2% by 1920. Black family life in the early decades of the 20th century was typically one featuring two-parent households. More than 4 out of 5 Negro families in New York in 1905 were headed by the father. As late as 1925, only 3% of black families in New York were headed by a woman under 20. The unwed teenage welfare mother emerged in a later era. While blacks were migrating from the South to the North, they were also migrating within the South, from the farms to the cities, and from one part of the South to another. Only about a fifth of Southern Negroes lived in metropolitan areas in 1900, but almost half did by 1960. This combination of interregional and intra-regional migration was a major reason why black income rose relative to white income during the period from 1940 to 1960. Birth rates among blacks have historically been higher than among whites, but have by no means been unique. As of 1910, for example, the number of children per woman among blacks was exceeded by the number among American women of Jewish, Polish, Italian, and Mexican ancestry. Over the years, the birth rates of black women have followed the national trends, generally falling from the 1920s to a low in the mid-1930s, rising again to new highs in the late 1950s, and now declining again. Birth rates among blacks in 1950 were about what they were in 1920. The internal distribution of children among blacks has made the upward movement of the race as a whole more difficult. The general tendency of poor people to have more children than middle-class people has been accentuated among American Negroes. Better educated and higher income blacks have even fewer children than their white counterparts, while low-income blacks have even more children than equally low-income whites. Much of the struggle that brought some blacks up from poverty has had to be repeated in successive generations because successful blacks did not have enough children to reproduce themselves. Education and culture. At the turn of the century, nearly half of the black population in the United States was still illiterate. By 1920, less than a quarter of all Negroes were still illiterate, and that figure was cut in half again over the next 20 years. It was 1930 before the average American Negro had 6 years of schooling, compared to 10 years of schooling for contemporary whites. The educational differences were even greater than the years of schooling would indicate. Black children in parts of the South spent only 2/3 as many days in school per year as white children. For the South as a whole, expenditures per black pupil in 1912 were less than 1/3 the expenditures per white pupil, and in the Deep South, the disparity was even greater. Black teachers had less training and taught larger classes. The great migrations to the northern cities brought both quantitative and qualitative improvements in the education of Negro children. So too did the migration from the rural South, where discrimination was greatest, into the southern cities. Segregation of the races in the schools facilitated discriminatory treatment and remained pervasive throughout the South until after the 1954 Supreme Court desegregation decision in Brown v. Board of Education. As late as 1910, there were no public high schools at all for black children in the states of Alabama, Georgia, or Louisiana, and about half of the elementary schools in these states were in makeshift quarters, homes, churches, etc., rather than in school buildings. As late as the 1930s, only 14% of black children in the South reached high school. But a few high-quality black high schools were created during this era. In Washington in 1870, Baltimore in 1892, New Orleans in 1916, and, after a bitter political struggle by blacks, the first and only black high school in the state of Georgia was built in Atlanta in 1924. These early high schools contributed a disproportionate share of the black pioneers of later years. Their alumni were graduating from Ivy League colleges, while a majority of blacks in school were still in the first 4 grades. It was one measure of the large internal social differences among Negroes. Higher education showed these internal class differences even more clearly. The light-complexioned descendants of the Negro elites continued dominant as both students and faculty at the black colleges well into the 20th century. It was only after World War II that the children of the black masses became the predominant element in the Negro colleges, many as a result of the GI Bill. As for educational quality, most Negro colleges and universities began after the Civil War teaching elementary and secondary school material to most of their students, and as late as World War I, the great bulk of their college students were still studying pre-college material, with only 3 black colleges teaching predominantly college material. In the 1920s, these institutions began to become colleges in fact as well as in name. But even the best of the black colleges remained well below the level of high-quality national institutions by almost any index. As the children of the black masses flooded into the colleges, their lack of preparation, reading habits, or intellectual discipline made top-quality education difficult to achieve. The slow but steady opening of opportunities for black students in leading American universities led more and more of the better-prepared black students to go elsewhere. In the 1960s, more black students went to white colleges than to black colleges. Although the black masses made slow and painful progress in formal education during the period of the Great Migrations, they were nevertheless developing a new cultural style in the urban ghettos of the North. They spoke, dressed, and lived differently. Their music was no longer the old Southern spiritual, but modern jazz. Many prominent blacks began to emerge into the national limelight during the same era, notably in music, with great jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, composers like W.C. Handy, St. Louis Blues, and Scott Joplin, singers like Roland Hayes and Marian Anderson, and in popular music, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, and many others emerged in fields from vaudeville to the fine arts. Paul Robeson became famous first as an All-American football player, then as a singer, and finally as a radical political figure. In boxing, Jack Johnson became the first black heavyweight champion. And then, decades later, Joe Louis won a new respect for black Americans in general, both as champion and as a man of great dignity and sportsmanship. The cultural and psychic changes during the 1920s caused many to speak of a new Negro. Confidence and assertiveness appeared in the music and literature of the blacks, as well as in their politics and demeanor. The Great Depression dampened many of the optimistic hopes for further progress, but the momentum resumed when that decade passed. Along with the slow, steady economic rise of blacks in general came a new middle class, risen from the black masses rather than descended from the mulatto elite. They displaced or merged with the old elite in many northern cities. A few of the newly arrived blacks had substantial fortunes. Madam C.J. Walker became the first black woman millionaire with her cosmetics firm. John Johnson rose from shoeshine boy in Chicago to become owner of the multi-million-dollar Johnson Publishing Enterprises, Ebony, Jet, etc. Other blacks became millionaires in life insurance, sports, and entertainment. West Indians. Not all of the black migration into the northern cities was from the rural South. Beginning in the early 20th century, a stream of black immigrants moved to New York's Harlem from the islands of Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and from other parts of the British West Indies. By the 1920s, 1/4 of Harlem's population was West Indian. Nationally, West Indians have been about 1% of the black population, but have been disproportionately overrepresented among black professionals, businessmen, and public figures. Prominent blacks of West Indian ancestry have included Marcus Garvey, James Weldon Johnson, Claude McKay, Shirley Chisholm, Malcolm X, Kenneth B. Clark, W. Arthur Lewis, Sidney Poitier, and Harry Belafonte. While not racially distinct from American Negroes, West Indians have had a different cultural background and have remained socially distinct from the other blacks around them. Intermarriage rates between the two groups have historically been extremely low. The overwhelming majority of West Indians in America marry other West Indians, even though living in communities of American blacks or even when attending colleges where the great bulk of other students are American Negroes. Differences between the two groups go back into history and are still reflected today in substantial socioeconomic differences. These differences provide some clues as to how much of the situation of American Negroes in general can be attributed to color prejudice by whites and how much to cultural patterns among blacks. History. During the era of slavery, the British West Indies, like the North American colonies, received a mixture of Negroes representing many African tribes. There is no evidence of any initial difference in the mixture of people brought to the West Indies and to America. In fact, the West Indian Islands were an interim stop for many African slaves who later ended up in the American colonies. For those who remained in bondage in the West Indies, slavery was usually even harsher than in the American South. The cost of raising slaves in the West Indies was considered higher than the cost of importing replacements from Africa, and the slaves were treated accordingly. The black population of the islands was never able to fully reproduce itself, but had to be constantly supplemented by continuous importations from Africa. Jamaica alone imported over 800,000 slaves between 1690 and 1820, but its total black population from 1820 was less than half the number imported. Barbados had a declining black population in the 17th and 18th centuries, despite continued imports. By contrast, the United States never imported as many slaves as Jamaica, but the American Negro population grew to about 5 million people by 1860 through natural increase. Slavery in the West Indies was usually large-scale plantation slavery, much larger than in the United States. These huge commercial operations, usually sugar growing, typically had absentee owners living in London. Complete control was in the hands of local white attorneys and overseers, whose financial incentives were to maximize current production, on which they received a percentage, at all costs, without regard to the long-run cost in terms of worn-out slaves or worn-out land. Slave owners in the United States usually lived on their own farms or plantations and were thus able to impose a longer-run view of how the slaves and the land should be treated. One of the differences was that infant mortality among slaves in the West Indies was several times what it was among the slaves in the United States. The sexual exploitation of black women by white men, which was episodic in the United States, was more systemic, pervasive, and even commercial in the West Indies. West Indian overseers and much of the small white population of the islands were usually sojourning bachelors, while in the United States, slave owners preferred to hire married overseers precisely to avoid problems brought on by overseers who had sexual relations with slave women. The paternalistic relations that sometimes mitigated the worst features of slavery in the United States had little place in the mass production commercial plantation slavery of the West Indies. A contemporary observer in the 18th century noted that the Britons in the West Indies were never familiar with their slaves, never smile upon them, and had little to say to them. The Briton sees that they are well fed, but also exercises those cruelties at which human nature, no less, recoils. Because the West Indian population was overwhelmingly black, while the American population was predominantly white, the British to some extent followed the Latin policy of divide and rule by making distinctions among free Negroes on the basis of color. Gradations of color continued to fragment the West Indian Negro population down through history, more so than it did the black population of the United States. In short, the most bitterly criticized features of slavery, callous overwork, sexual exploitation, Negro fragmentation, and self-denigration of blackness, were worse in the West Indies than in the United States. However, several other features of West Indian slavery that have received less attention may help explain the greater success of West Indians in the United States. Unlike slaves in the United States, who were issued food rations and were often fed from the common kitchen, West Indian slaves were assigned land and time to raise their own food. They sold surplus food in the market to buy amenities for themselves. In short, West Indian Negroes had centuries of experience in taking care of themselves in a significant part of their lives, even under slavery, as well as experience with buying and selling. Contemporary observers noted that the slaves in the West Indies worked perceptibly more energetically on their own plots of ground than on the land they worked for slave owners. They had the kind of incentives and experience common in a market economy, but denied American slaves for 2 centuries. West Indian slaves were emancipated on August 1st, 1838, a generation earlier than blacks in the United States. Moreover, there was a period of preparation of slaves for freedom in the West Indies, rather than the literally overnight sudden emancipation in the United States. Much of the immediate post-emancipation history of blacks in the West Indies paralleled that of American Negroes in the South. Peonage virtually re-enslaved West Indian blacks. A disastrous decline in the sugar market spread economic distress through the West Indies, as wartime disruptions likewise plunged the postbellum South into economic distress. Poverty was pervasive among West Indian Negroes. Many immigrated to various parts of the world, some permanently and many as sojourners. Most of those who came to the United States settled in New York City. West Indians in the United States. There was some trickle of emigration from the West Indies to the United States as far back as the 18th century, but significant numbers of black West Indians began to arrive in the United States, and principally in New York City, in the 20th century. About 30,000 arrived in the first decade of the century, more than twice as many in the second decade, and about 40,000 during the 1920s. By 1930, foreign-born blacks, mostly West Indians, were about 1% of the American Negro population. There were more males than females in the early years, but the sex ratio was almost balanced by 1930. As in the case of native black migrants, most West Indian immigrants were young. More than half were under 30 years of age. About 40% of those who arrived in the first quarter of the century had been laborers or servants in the islands, and another 10 to 20% had worked in agriculture. Only about 4% had worked in the professions. In short, the occupational level of the early West Indian immigrants was not very different from that of the southern black migrants who arrived in the urban Northeast at about the same time. The West Indian immigrants were not quite so predominantly from an agricultural background, however, and more were from industrial or commercial occupations. Unlike the southern rural migrants, 80% of the West Indian immigrants were from cities. The contrast between the West Indians and the American Negroes was not so much in their occupational backgrounds as in their behavior patterns. West Indians were much more frugal, hardworking, and entrepreneurial. Their children worked harder and outperformed native black children in school. West Indians in the United States had lower fertility rates and lower crime rates than either black or white Americans. As early as 1901, West Indians owned 20% of all black businesses in Manhattan, although they were only 10% of the black population there. American Negroes called them Black Jews. Separation, hostility, and conflict have long marked the relationship between the two black groups. This has not usually been so overt or violent as some other intra-ethnic conflicts. Still, the suspicions and recriminations between the two groups have extended from the man in the street to the intellectual leaders of both groups. The restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s brought the West Indian movement to the United States to a sudden halt. Revisions of the immigration laws later led to a sharply increased inflow of West Indians in the 1960s and 1970s, about 90,000 people in each decade. About 15% of them were professionals and another 12% white-collar. West Indians in the United States have continued to hold sizable advantages over American Negroes in incomes and occupations. As of 1969, West Indian incomes were 28% higher than the incomes of other blacks in New York City, and 52% higher nationally. Second-generation West Indians have higher incomes than whites. While native blacks were substantially underrepresented in the professions, a slightly higher than average percentage of West Indians were professionals. While native blacks had an unemployment rate above the national average, West Indian blacks had an unemployment rate below the national average. As of 1970, the highest-ranking blacks in New York's police department were all West Indians, as were all black federal judges in the city. For many years, successive borough presidents of Manhattan were all West Indians. Paradoxically, the very success and prominence of West Indian individuals have contributed to their invisibility as a group. West Indians, as such, are too small a group to have any political power, so West Indian individuals in public office hold their positions as representatives of the black population as a whole. To stress their specifically West Indian background would undermine their positions with blacks and whites alike. Moreover, the many West Indians in civil rights movements must attribute black poverty and unemployment almost solely to white racism, although the West Indian experience itself seriously undermines the proposition that color is a fatal handicap in the American economy. Even those West Indians in the private sector of the economy may be dependent on the large black population for their prosperity. Many are businessmen, doctors, lawyers, publishers, and others whose customers or clientele are American Negroes. West Indian immigrants in England are not nearly as successful there, perhaps because of the absence of a large non-West Indian black population to provide them with a constituency. Black Americans today. Along with the rising educational and skill level of the black population have come changes in the white population and in political and legal institutions. The period since World War II has been a turning point in the history of American racial and ethnic groups in general. Shortages of manpower, civilian and military, during World War II broke down many barriers. The first black Marines in history were trained in 1942. 2 black air combat units fought in Europe under the command of Benjamin O. Davis, the first black general. In civilian life, many wartime jobs opened up to applicants without regard to race, sex, or other such criteria. In the post-war era, President Harry Truman made civil rights a major part of his election platform of 1948, even at the cost of splitting his party, losing southern states for the first time in decades, and jeopardizing his own election. Courts began to strike down discriminatory laws and practices as unconstitutional. Professional sports that once excluded black athletes began to be dominated by black athletes. Many retrogressions and violence on both sides marred these advances, but the advances continued nevertheless. The steady rise in black incomes, occupations, and education, and declines in disease and mortality occurred while the rest of the American population was improving in all these respects as well. Gaps remained, and ratios showed no great change, despite widespread progress. The income of non-white families was 53% of the income of white families in 1948, and was the same percentage 15 years later, although both incomes had risen more than 50% in real terms, even allowing for inflation. Infant mortality rates declined by about a third for both blacks and whites from 1950 to 1970, but the black-white ratio, or gap, did not change greatly. Beginning in the mid-1960s, however, there were a number of areas in which blacks not only rose, but rose at a faster rate than whites. Between 1961 and 1971, white family income rose by 31%, while black family income rose by 55%. The proportion of college-aged young people who actually enrolled in college remained the same for whites between 1965 and 1972, but the proportion among blacks nearly doubled. The number of whites in professional-level occupations increased by about 1/5 between 1960 and 1972, while the number of blacks in such occupations nearly doubled. The number of black foremen, craftsmen, and policemen more than doubled, and the number of black engineers tripled. The number of blacks in Congress doubled between 1964 and 1972. So did the number of blacks in state legislatures across the country. In the South, the number of blacks in state legislatures more than quadrupled. The geographic distribution of blacks distorts national statistical comparisons. Despite more than half a century of massive migration, just over 1/2 of all American Negroes still live in the South, a region of generally lower money income and lower living costs for both blacks and whites. Less than 1/3 of whites live in the South. Black families living outside the South earn more than 40% higher incomes than black families within the South. Blacks in New York State earn more than twice as much as blacks in Mississippi. The geographic distribution of the population affects both black-white comparisons and comparisons with other ethnic groups. Age differences between groups add further distortions. While gross differences between blacks and whites remain large nationally, differences between blacks and whites of the same age have narrowed remarkably, especially outside the South. Among young married couples, under 35, living outside the South, blacks had 78% of white income in 1959 and 93% in 1971. When both husband and wife worked in both races, black couples earned 5% more than white couples in 1971. Nationally, Puerto Rican families earned slightly more than black families in 1969, but black families living outside the South earned more than Puerto Rican families, almost all of whom live outside the South. Even the substantial income advantage of Mexican Americans over blacks is a geographic phenomenon. Although Mexican American families earned higher incomes than black families nationally in 1970, black families in all regions other than the South had incomes above the national average for Mexican American families. Along with general progress, blacks have experienced retrogression in particular areas. The proportion of one-parent, female-headed black families increased from 18% in 1950 to 33% in 1973, from double the white percentage in 1950 to more than triple the white percentage in 1973. Despite attempts to depict this as a legacy of slavery, one-parent, female-headed black families were a rare phenomenon in earlier times, even under slavery. The proportion of blacks on welfare also rose during the 1960s and 1970s, as the proportion in poverty declined. The proportion of the black population that is working has been declining, both absolutely and relative to whites. Unemployment among blacks has risen, also absolutely and relative to whites. Black teenage unemployment in 1978 was more than 5 times what it had been 30 years earlier. Among the factors responsible, a number of government programs, notably the minimum wage laws, have made it more difficult for blacks to find jobs, and other government programs, notably welfare, have made it less necessary. A number of governmental efforts have been made to advance blacks, but these efforts are difficult to disentangle from the effects of growing black education, skill, geographic redistribution, and changing racial attitudes by whites that made the civil rights laws and other government activities possible. The most controversial of the government programs has been affirmative action, or racial quota hiring, established as goals and timetables in 1971. Economists have found these quota systems to have had little or no effect beyond what had already been achieved under equal opportunity policies in the 1960s. The public perception of affirmative action has, however, engendered strong resentment among whites in general, resentment exploited by growing racist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan and American Nazis, often in parts of the country where such organizations never flourished before. The historic alliance between Negro and Jewish organizations likewise broke up over the issue of quotas. Blacks are now part of virtually every American institution, from the halls of Congress and the Supreme Court to the baseball diamond and the gridiron and the basketball court. No recital of American folk heroes would be complete without Joe Louis, Willie Mays, or O.J. Simpson. American music and American slang have been flavored from the music and speech of Negroes. 3 blacks have won Nobel Prizes: in peace, Ralph Bunche and Martin Luther King Jr., and in economics, W. Arthur Lewis. Part of this represents the lowering of barriers and the opening of opportunity. It also represents long and arduous efforts to raise a whole people to a level where their efforts would bear fruit. Both renowned and unsung heroes have been part of the struggle, from the clandestine schools of the antebellum South to the Underground Railroad, from those dead at Gettysburg and Antietam to those dedicated schoolmarms who gave up their youth and tranquility to teach the children of slaves, from blacks who worked long hours in quiet obscurity to advance the race to others who put their lives on the line to gain justice. Blacks in higher or more visible places continue to be disproportionately descendants of black elite families from generations past, or West Indians. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, UN Ambassador Andrew Young, Secretary of the Army Clifford Alexander, and Julian Bond of Georgia represent the old families. Past and present core leaders, James Farmer and Roy Enos, are West Indians, as is Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm and California's former Lieutenant Governor Mervyn DeMalle. Similar patterns exist among black academics, where descendants of the free persons of color include John Hope Franklin and Alvin Toussaint, and West Indians include W. Arthur Lewis, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and Kenneth B. Clark, among many others. The long history of black people in America has had many landmarks and many profound changes: slavery, emancipation, the Great Migrations, and the Civil Rights Revolution of the mid-20th century, for example. Their rate of progress looks very different if measured from 1619, 1865, 1900, or 1954. Many of those living in the northern ghettos today are first or second generation migrants from the South, at the same stage where other blacks were 50 or 100 years ago. The race as a whole has moved from a position of utter destitution in money, knowledge, and rights to a place alongside other groups, emerging in the great struggle of life. None have had to come from so far back to join their fellow Americans.